mean I'll see it.
I never really understood how silence could feel so aggressive until that night. You know, that specific kind of quiet in a city? Not the peaceful kind, but the type where the air feels thin and stagnant, like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. I was walking home after a double shift, the kind of soul-crushing work that leaves your brain feeling like wet cardboard. The streetlights were those old, flickering sodium lamps that cast everything in a sickly, bruised shade of orange. My apartment was only 6 blocks away, a distance I'd covered 1,000 times, but that night, the sidewalk felt miles long. I saw him when I reached the intersection near the old park. He was standing directly under a lamp, maybe 50 yards ahead. At first, I thought he was drunk or maybe someone having a breakdown. He was wearing a dark suit, the kind you'd wear to a funeral, but it didn't fit right. The sleeves were too short, exposing wrists that looked unnaturally pale and thin, almost like bone wrapped in parchment. He was doing this movement. I can't even call it a walk. It was a jaunty, rhythmic dance, a sort of macabre waltz. He'd take a long, sliding step forward, then dip his shoulders, then slide again. I slowed down, my stomach doing a slow, nauseating roll. I figured if I just stayed quiet and kept my distance, he wouldn't notice me. But as he entered the pool of light from the next lamp, I saw his head. It was tilted back at an angle that should have snapped his neck. He was staring straight up at the dark sky, his throat exposed and pulsing, but his body was still aimed toward me. And then I saw the mouth. It wasn't just a smile. It was a cavernous, ear-to-ear tear in his face. His lips were pulled back so far they seemed to be disappearing into his cheeks, revealing gums that were dark and receding, and teeth that looked like shattered pieces of porcelain. The air around me began to feel oppressive and thick, like I was trying to breathe through a layer of wool. I stopped dead. He stopped, too. One foot was still hovering in the air, mid-stride, his body perfectly balanced in that grotesque, leaning position. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the distant hum of a transformer and the blood thrumming in my ears. I decided to cross the street, giving him the widest berth possible. I didn't take my eyes off him. I stepped off the curb, my boots clicking against the asphalt, sounding like gunshots in the stillness. As soon as I reached the other side, he moved. He didn't just walk, he mirrored me. He stepped off his curb with that same sliding, dipping motion, his head still craned back toward the stars, that horrific grin never wavering. He was moving faster now. The dance had become more frantic, his limbs flailing slightly as if they were being jerked by invisible wires. I picked up my pace, my heart slamming against my ribs. I wasn't just nervous anymore. I was terrified. There was something fundamentally wrong with the way he moved. It wasn't human. It was like watching a predator try to mimic a person based on a bad description. I looked back over my shoulder. He was closer. The orange light hit his face again, and I realized why the smile looked so wrong. It wasn't a natural expression. The corners of his mouth had been sliced. Raw, jagged scar tissue climbed toward his ears, and the wounds were weeping a dark, viscous fluid that looked black under the sodium lamps. It wasn't the metallic scent of fresh blood that hit me. It was the cloying, sweet stench of a butcher shop that hasn't been cleaned in a week, the smell of meat left out to turn in the heat. I broke into a light jog. I heard the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of his dress shoes hitting the pavement. He was keeping pace effortlessly. I turned another corner, hoping to lose him in the shadows of the alleyways, but when I glanced back, he was sprinting. He had abandoned the dance. He was bent over at the waist, his long arms swinging wildly, his head still tilted back so he was looking at the buildings behind him while running full tilt toward me. The sight was so absurdly horrific it felt like a fever dream. I reached my apartment building, fumbling blindly in my pocket for my keys. My fingers were numb, dragging against the denim. I could hear his breathing now. It wasn't a gasp or a pant, it was a wet, rattling whistle, like air passing through a punctured lung. I finally snagged the keychain and jammed the jagged metal into the lock. I threw my weight against the door, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut, throwing every bolt I had. I stood in the dim hallway, gasping for air, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a soft, rhythmic thud. He had reached the door. I crept toward the peephole, my skin crawling, every instinct screaming at me to run up the stairs. I leaned in, my eye hovering just inches from the glass. He was standing there. He was no longer tilted back. He was leaning forward, his face inches from the wood of the door. Up close, without the distortion of the streetlights, he looked even worse. The suit was stained with broad, dark patches, too dark to be water. The skin of his face was a mottled, sickly gray, and his eyes, they were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of pupils. Just two milky orbs swimming in a sea of red. He wasn't blinking. He just stood there, that carved-out smile vibrating slightly with the force of his rattling breath. Then he did something that still keeps me awake. He didn't try to break in. He didn't scream. He simply raised one of those long, skeletal hands and began to slowly, methodically stroke the door. His fingernails, yellowed and cracked, scraped against the paint with a dry, rhythmic sound. He did this for an hour. I stayed there, paralyzed, watching him through the tiny circle of glass. Eventually, he turned around and waltzed back into the darkness, dipping and sliding until the shadows swallowed him whole. The next morning, I found what he had left. It wasn't a mark or a message. It was a pile of something on the welcome mat. It looked like a heap of discarded rags at first, but the smell hit me before I even got close. It was a suit jacket, identical to the one he'd been wearing, but it was soaked through, stiffening as it dried. When the police arrived and turned it over, they found pieces of skin stuck to the inner lining, as if the person who had been wearing it had been flayed before the garment was removed. They never found him. They checked the cameras, but the footage was always just a blur of orange light and a dark shape that moved too fast for the frame rate to capture. But sometimes, when I'm walking home and the city gets too quiet, I hear it. The distant, rhythmic slap, slap, slap of dress shoes on the pavement. And I know, deep in my gut, that he's still out there, dancing in the dark, waiting for someone else to look back.
Next story.
We moved into that house because of the garden. It was one of those sprawling, overgrown lots in a neighborhood where the trees are so old they seem to lean over the road, trying to touch each other. My daughter, Sophie, was 4 at the time, and she loved it. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. It felt like we had finally found a place where the air didn't feel stagnant. But then, Sophie started talking about her new friend. At first, it was just the usual kid stuff. She'd be playing with her blocks and mentioned that Happy liked the blue ones. I figured it was an imaginary friend, a way for her to process the move and the new environment. I even played along for a while, asking if Happy wanted a seat at the dinner table or if she liked the drawings Sophie made at preschool. Sophie would just shake her head and say that Happy only came out when the sun went down. That should have been my first warning. The nursery was at the end of a long hallway, tucked away from the master bedroom. We used a high-end baby monitor, one of those with the night vision and the two-way audio. About a month into living there, I started waking up at odd hours. I would look at the monitor on my nightstand and see Sophie sitting up in bed, whispering. The camera didn't pick up what she was saying, but she was looking toward the corner of the room, right by the closet. There was never anyone there, just the shadows cast by her stuffed animals. One night, the air in our bedroom felt thick and stifling, making it hard to catch a full breath. I checked the monitor and saw Sophie wasn't in her bed. She was standing by the window, her tiny hands pressed against the glass. I watched, my heart doing a strange, fluttering rhythm in my chest as she turned around and started laughing. It wasn't her usual toddler giggle. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like she was mimicking someone else. She walked back to the center of the room and looked up into the corner where the ceiling met the closet door. She waved. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I decided to go down there, thinking maybe she was sleepwalking or just needed some water. As I walked down the hallway, the floorboards felt unusually cold under my feet. I opened her door quietly, not wanting to startle her. She was back in bed, fast asleep, her breathing deep and even. I looked in the closet, checked under the bed, and peered out the window. Nothing. The latch was locked, and the room was silent. The next evening, the smell started. It wasn't the smell of a dead mouse or a plumbing issue. It was something more visceral. It was a sharp, iron-rich scent, like a steak that had been left on the counter for too long in the sun, mixed with the damp, cloying odor of wet earth. I checked the vents, thinking maybe something had crawled in there and died, but the air coming out was clean. The scent seemed to be concentrated right around Sophie's bed. I decided to keep the monitor right next to my pillow that night. I didn't fall asleep until late, and when I did, it was a restless, fitful kind of rest. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a sound that wasn't a sound at all. It was a vibration, a low-frequency hum that seemed to rattle the back of my skull. I grabbed the monitor. The screen was grainy, the infrared light washing everything in a sickly, pale green. Sophie was asleep, but something was different. In the corner of the room, tucked into the narrow space between the dresser and the wall, there was a shape. It was dark, a mass that didn't belong to the furniture. I squinted, my eyes straining against the low resolution. The shape shifted. It began to uncoil, rising from a deep crouch. It was a woman, but her proportions were all wrong. Her arms were too long, her elbows knobby and sharp as they braced against the wallpaper. She was wearing a dress that looked like it had been dragged through a swamp, stained with dark, crusty patches that seemed to swallow the light. She didn't look at Sophie. She looked directly at the camera. Her face was a nightmare of anatomy. Her eyes were wide, the whites showing all the way around the pupils, reflecting the infrared glow like a cat's. But it was her mouth that stopped my heart. It was stretched open, wider than any human jaw should be able to manage. Her fingers, thin, skeletal things with dirt jammed under the nails, were hooked into the corners of her mouth, pulling the skin back toward her ears. I could see the glistening red of her gums, the yellow tint of her teeth, and the way the skin of her cheeks looked paper-thin, ready to tear under the pressure. She was forcing a smile so intense it looked like it was causing her physical agony. She stayed like that, perfectly still, staring into my eyes through the screen. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She just held that horrific, finger-assisted grin. I didn't think. I didn't grab a weapon. I just sprinted. I flew down the hallway, my shoulders slamming into the doorframe of Sophie's room as I burst inside. I threw the light switch, the sudden brightness stinging my eyes. The room was empty. Sophie bolted upright, screaming in terror at my sudden entrance. I rushed to her, pulling her out of the bed, my eyes darting to the corner. The woman was gone. The space between the dresser and the wall was barely 6 inches wide. No adult could have fit there. But as I stood there, clutching my sobbing daughter, I saw the window. The latch I had locked earlier was flipped up. The window was cracked open just an inch, letting in the damp night air. And there, on the pale floral wallpaper right where her face had been, were 2 muddy handprints. They weren't just dirty, they were oily, leaving a dark residue that smelled of that same raw, iron-rich rot. Below the handprints, there was a smear of something wet and translucent, saliva, mixed with a faint, pinkish tint of fluid from gums that had been stretched to the breaking point. I called the police, but of course, they found nothing. They checked the perimeter, looked for footprints in the garden, and poked around the basement. They told me it was probably a prowler who got spooked, though they couldn't explain how she got in or out so fast. They didn't see the expression I saw. They didn't feel the way the air seemed to curdle around her. We didn't stay in the house that night. We went to a hotel, and the next day, I started the process of breaking the lease. While I was packing our things, I found Sophie's sketchbook under her bed. I had seen her drawing in it dozens of times, but I had never really looked at the pages. The first few drawings were what you'd expect: sunflowers, our cat, a lopsided house. But the last 10 pages were different. They were all of the same figure. A tall, thin woman with long, messy hair. In every single drawing, the woman had her hands up to her face, her fingers pulling her mouth into a giant, U-shaped curve. In the later drawings, Sophie had used a red crayon to color in the area around the mouth, pressing so hard the wax had built up in thick, jagged clumps. I found something else, too. In the back of the closet, hidden behind a loose piece of baseboard, there was a small cavity. Inside, there was a collection of things. A silver spoon from our kitchen. One of Sophie's hair ribbons. A pile of fingernail clippings, hundreds of them, all neatly stacked like tiny, translucent shells. And there was a photograph. It was a Polaroid of me and Sophie, taken from outside our living room window. We were sitting on the couch, reading a book. The photo was recent, but it had been handled so much the edges were frayed. On the back, written in a cramped, shaky hand that looked like someone had struggled to hold the pen, was a single sentence: "She doesn't smile enough." We moved 3 states away. I have cameras in every room now, high-definition ones that record to the cloud. I spend hours every night scrolling through the footage, checking every corner, every shadow. Sophie doesn't talk about happy anymore. She's a quiet kid, maybe too quiet. The doctors say she's just traumatized by the break-in. But sometimes, when I'm tucking her in, I catch her looking at the corners of the ceiling. And every morning, when she wakes up, the first thing she does is check her reflection in the mirror. She stands there for a long time, using her small, trembling fingers to pull the corners of her mouth up toward her ears, making sure she's smiling. She tells me she has to do it. She says if she doesn't keep her face happy, the lady will come back to help her fix it. And when I look at the way Sophie's skin is starting to thin around her lips, the way her gums are always slightly inflamed and bleeding, I realize that the woman didn't just want to watch us. She was teaching. I haven't slept a full night in 3 years. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pale, green-washed face on the monitor, the fingers hooked into the cheeks, the silent, agonizing joy. I know she's still out there. I can feel the weight of her gaze sometimes, an oppressive presence that lingers just out of sight. And the worst part isn't the fear that she'll come back. It's the smell. Every once in a while, when the house is quiet and the sun has gone down, I'll catch a whiff of it, that raw, iron-rich scent of something that has been kept open for far too long.
Next story.
You know how when someone dies, you end up becoming a ghost hunter in their own home? That was me a few months back. My grandfather passed away, and since I was the only one in the family without a full-time career or a house full of kids, the job of clearing out his old place fell on me. He lived in this drafty, salt-knot house near the coast, a place that always felt like it was leaning away from the wind. He was a quiet man, the kind of guy who kept his secrets behind a wall of cigarette smoke and crossword puzzles. I didn't expect to find anything beyond old bills and moth-eaten suits, but then I found that wooden cigar box tucked behind the insulation in the attic. Inside were dozens of Polaroids from the mid-50s. Most of them were mundane, shots of the coastline, the old truck he used to drive, or my grandmother looking stiff and uncomfortable in a sundress. But there was one that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a shot of my grandfather standing in the backyard, right near the edge of the woods. He looked younger, obviously, but there was a strange expression on his face, like he was bracing himself for a blow. In the background, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive, dying oak tree, there was a figure. It was just a smudge of gray and charcoal, a blurry shape that shouldn't have been there. I took it downstairs to the kitchen where the light was better. The more I looked at it, the more it bothered me. It looked like a man in a long, tattered coat, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms seemed to dangle too low, and the head was tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal neck. Being a product of my generation, I figured I could solve the mystery with technology. I downloaded one of those high-end AI photo enhancement apps on my phone, the kind that uses neural networks to fill in missing details and sharpen blurry edges. I scanned the Polaroid and let the app go to work. I watched the little loading circles spin, feeling a sense of mounting dread that I couldn't quite explain. The air in the kitchen felt oppressive and dense, like the atmosphere right before a massive thunderstorm. When the phone finally chimed, I almost dropped it. The AI hadn't just sharpened the image, it had reconstructed it with terrifying, surgical precision. The figure behind the tree was clear now. It was a man, if you could call him that. He wore a coat that looked like it had been dragged through a slaughterhouse floor, stained, stiff, and fraying at the hem. His skin was the color of wet parchment. But it was the face that made my stomach turn. The AI had corrected the blurry pixels into a face that defied biology. He was looking directly at the camera with a smile that was physically impossible. It didn't stop at the cheeks, it carved a path all the way back to his ears, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth that were stained a dark, necrotic yellow. His eyes were wide, glassy, and devoid of pupils, reflecting the flash of the camera from 70 years ago as if it were happening right now. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. The image looked too real, too high definition for a photo from the 50s. It looked like a window. I deleted the file immediately, my thumb shaking as I hit the trash icon. I didn't just delete it, I wiped the cache and uninstalled the app. I wanted that face out of my digital life, away from my sight. I left the original Polaroid on the kitchen table and went to bed, locking my bedroom door for the first time since I'd moved in. That night, I didn't sleep. I just laid there listening to the house groan. The silence was stifling, a thick, suffocating blanket that made every heartbeat sound like a hammer against a floorboard. I kept thinking about my grandfather's face in that photo. He wasn't just looking at the camera, he was looking at the thing behind him. He knew it was there. When the sun finally started to bleed through the curtains, I felt a small measure of relief. I got up, my muscles stiff and leaden, and walked out to the kitchen to make some coffee. The Polaroid was gone. I searched the table, the floor, and even checked the trash can, thinking maybe I'd tossed it in a fit of sleepwalking. Nothing. I felt a cold chill wash over me as I walked back toward my bedroom. There, sitting perfectly centered on my nightstand, was the original Polaroid. My heart was thumping against my ribs so hard it hurt. I picked it up with 2 fingers, my skin crawling. The photo had changed. My grandfather was still there, looking terrified, but the figure behind the tree was gone. The space behind the oak was empty, just the blurred leaves and the gray morning light of 1954. The smudge, the tattered coat, the monster, it was all gone. I felt a strange, frantic urge to clean myself, to wash away the feeling of that paper on my skin. I hurried into the small, cramped bathroom and turned the cold water on full blast. I splashed my face, eyes closed tight, trying to breathe through the panic. The air in the bathroom began to change. It started to smell wrong. It didn't smell like old pipes or mildew. It smelled like a butcher's shop at the end of a long, hot day. It was the scent of raw, cooling meat and the metallic tang of iron left to rest in a bucket. I grabbed a towel and wiped my face, then looked up into the mirror. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had been filled with wet sand. My reflection was looking back at me, but it wasn't my face anymore. My eyes were the same, wide and brimming with tears, but my mouth was wrong. It was stretching. I could feel the skin at the corners of my lips beginning to give way, the tissue audibly popping like overstretched stitches. I watched in the mirror as my jaw unhinged further than I ever thought possible. The AI hadn't just enhanced the photo, it had provided a template. The corners of my mouth tore upward toward my ears, leaving jagged, weeping rifts that leaked a thick, dark fluid, not bright red, but a deep, bruised purple that looked like spoiled wine. I reached up to touch it, and my fingers sank into the raw, exposed muscle of my own cheeks. The pain was distant, eclipsed by the sheer, visceral horror of the transformation. I could see my own teeth, all of them, even the ones in the very back, as my face continued to reconstruct itself into that Ultra HD nightmare I had seen on my phone. My reflection began to smile, a wide, gleaming crescent of ivory and blood, while my actual mind was howling in the dark. The worst part isn't the pain, or the smell of my own cooling blood filling the small room. The worst part is the feeling of my own muscles being hijacked. My hands aren't mine anymore. They reached out and grabbed the edge of the sink, steadying me as I leaned closer to the glass. My reflection leaned in too, until our noses were almost touching. Through the tears blurring my vision, I saw something else in the mirror. Behind me, standing in the doorway of the bathroom, was the man in the tattered coat. He wasn't blurry anymore. He was as clear as the person standing in front of him. He reached out a long, gray hand and rested it on my shoulder. His grip was cold, like a piece of meat pulled straight from the freezer. He didn't say anything. He just watched as the correction continued. I can feel my teeth sharpening now, grinding against each other as they shift in my gums. I can feel my eyes starting to go glassy, the pupils dilating until the world is just a wash of gray and shadow. I'm still in the house. I haven't left the bathroom in what feels like hours, or maybe it's been days. The sun comes and goes, but the smell of raw iron never leaves. I tried to call for help once, but all that came out was a wet, clicking sound. My mouth is too big for words now. It's only built for one thing. I'm waiting for someone to come by and check on me. Maybe a neighbor or a delivery driver. I'll be standing right here, just behind the door, out of sight. And when they look in the mirror to see what that smell is, I'll show them the smile my grandfather tried so hard to hide. It's much clearer now. Everything is so much clearer.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.